Donald Trump says he'll impose 30% tariffs on imports from the European Union and Mexico starting next month. Weeks of negotiations with Brussels failed to reach a comprehensive trade deal. Trump blamed, quote, long-term and persistent trade deficits with the EU. The European Commission says the EU will impose countermeasures if necessary. On Mexico, Trump says the government has not done enough to curb cross-border drug trafficking. Trump made similar tariff threats against dozens of other trading partners earlier this week. Well, for more from Washington, we're joined now by DW correspondent Janelle Dumalaon. Janelle, good to see you. So we do know that the EU is taking Trump's threats very seriously. But what about the impact on American markets and ordinary consumers? What could these tariffs mean for them?
Well, the fact of the matter is that we have to remember that a lot of these import taxes are paid by the companies, and these companies will be inclined to pass on the costs of these tariffs to consumers. So that means a lot of things could be becoming more expensive for American consumers. So what comes from the EU and what would then become more expensive in America? So you have to think of your German cars, your German machinery, your French wine and cheese, your Irish pharmaceuticals, your Greek olive oil. As for Mexico, well, you have a lot of produce. You have to think of your avocados. You have to think of your tomatoes. You also have a lot of machinery and appliances that come out of Mexico. It's also worth remembering here that a lot of companies actually switch parts of their supply chains to Mexico in order to better align with this U.S., Mexico, Canada trade agreement. So this sort of leaves them in the lurch here. Now, with regard to the markets, what we're seeing now is that the markets are down, but not panicking. Perhaps they are banking on a change of heart from Trump just because that is what they have seen as what historically happens. But the fact of the matter is, we don't know if it's going to stay that way, and we do not, in fact, know what Trump himself is going to do.
Well, Janelle, you mentioned it yourself. We've seen just since he took office again, this time Trump has imposed tariffs, he's suspended them, he's increased them, he's lowered them. It is very chaotic, but is there some sort of method? Is there something more behind this approach?
Yeah, so just to refresh the memory of our viewers, remember that this original announcement of sweeping tariffs that the U.S. is imposing on most of its trading partners in the world, that took place on April 2. Trump called it Liberation Day, and those tariffs were then paused, and that pause elapsed earlier this week. We now have a new deadline of August 1. We're seeing tariffs either remain at the same level as those so-called Liberation Day tariffs or be a little higher. But then you do have that new deadline. Now, what the goal of this back and forth is, that's kind of hard to say because Trump's tariff regime itself has also been associated with a mix of somewhat contradictory goals, whether it's addressing trade deficits, returning manufacturing to the U.S., or generating revenue from import taxes. Those are goals that don't really go together. But what this back and forth, what these sliding deadlines do tell us is that the Trump administration did not get the deals they said they were going to get. We were told there would be 90 deals in 90 days. So far, we have seen kind of framework agreements between the U.S. and China, the U.S. and the U.K., as well as the U.S. and Vietnam, although nobody has seen the official text of the agreement with Vietnam, so nobody really knows what's in it. Now, the EU, for its part, has signaled that it wants to keep talking, but what is left for them to figure out is whether Trump is, in fact, still interested in deal-making, or whether he's shifting his focus from the onerous and time-consuming process of making trade deals towards finding ways to generate revenue in order to fund what he calls his big, beautiful bill. We now know that's the law of the land. Now, if it does end up being the latter, then that could mean that Trump might be inclined to keep the tariffs, which would not bode so well for the EU and, as we've said, for the American consumer.
And just quickly, Janelle, how did Trump justify the threat of these tariffs this time?
Well, this is the same language that he uses all the time. He feels that the EU is pulling one over the US, rather. He said that the EU was not doing enough to sufficiently address trade imbalances. Remember, this is somebody who has said that the EU was specifically created in order to make life difficult for America. This is something that he thinks the EU is. He's not been supportive of the EU project as such. He sees the EU almost as an adversary rather than as a trade partner. And we keep seeing examples of that, and this letter is just the latest one.
That was DW's Janelle Dumalaon reporting for us from Washington, D.C. Janelle, we appreciate it. Thank you so much. Let's get the perspective from both sides of the Atlantic. And for that, I'm joined now by financial correspondent Jens Korte, who's in New York, and DW correspondent Tessa Walther, who joins us from Brussels. Good to see you both. Tessa, if I may, the first question goes to you. What kind of an impact could these tariffs have on European markets?
I can tell you that will be a dramatic impact, really, because we are talking about goods worth hundreds of billions of euro that are affected here. And this is also why the European Commission was very, very quick to react. Within minutes, we had a statement here in Brussels that was going around. And let me just read out some of the most important bits for you. So the Commission says that these 30% would disrupt essentially the transatlantic supply chains that are in place at the moment to the detriment of consumers, businesses, patients. It also says that it has always shown that it was ready for a deal, that it wants this deal, and that it also wants a constructive partnership with the US long term, and that it also wants to make use of this time remaining until August 1st to use this time to find a deal. But, and this is important, it also says the EU is ready to take countermeasures, meaning if you play with us like that, we can also react. And I mean, this shows that they don't really know what they're doing now. There are a trade ministers meeting on Monday here in Brussels, but an all-out trade war would have dramatic consequences. For consumers, for example, if countermeasures, counter-tariffs would be put in place. Things like Levi's would become more expensive, but also oranges or Teslas. But on a larger scale, we would also have the industry suffering job losses. And the US-EU trade is so important that that could mean that an economic downturn might loom for the European Union.
All right, so clear that the European Union is taking the prospect of this level of tariffs very seriously. Now, Jens, what about American markets and consumers? Isn't it safe to say that these tariffs would also hurt them?
Yeah, sure, it would have an impact. I mean, especially if you look at the industry, for example. So what are the main goods that are imported from the European Union? I mean, we are talking pharmaceuticals, we are talking chemicals, we are talking machinery. So that is not that easily replaced. And if you import it to the US on a higher tariff, that will cost companies, that will increase costs for consumers, and overall also increase all the uncertainty that we are already seeing. The European Union is the most important trading partner as a bloc to the United States. I mean, last year, if you look back and forth trade, we are roughly talking about $1 trillion. If you look at services, for instance, and that's what the EU is always pointing to, the EU is actually even running a deficit towards the United States. So let's see if there might be some agreement possible. But yes, I mean, if this thing escalates, I mean, that would also hit US consumers and corporations. And maybe just very briefly, so as I mentioned, the EU is the biggest trading partner. But Donald Trump also said if there are countermeasures from the European Union, those would come on top of the 30% that Donald Trump announced in his letter.
Well, we have to remember this seems to be just the latest in a series of rather chaotic policy moves by President Trump. I mean, he's imposed tariffs on numerous trading partners, then he halted them, he increased them, he lowered them. Jens, what could be behind these tactics?
Mariana, and that is the big question. Is it tactics, or is it willingly what this administration is doing? I mean, we all saw what happened after Liberation Day on April 2nd. Markets freaked, and then finally, or eventually, the US government gave in for now. But what we're seeing in these days right now, I mean, some of the tariffs are even steeper than those that were announced on April 2nd. The EU back then, 20% tariffs. Now we're talking 30% tariff. Just this week, Donald Trump threatened copper imports with 50%. He threatened imports from Brazil with tariffs on 50%. And what we shouldn't forget, the United States is partly using those tariffs politically. They're using it because of trade deficits, but they're also using it as income to pay for the big, beautiful bill that got signed a week ago. So let's wait and see how serious the US government is this time, and if August 1st is really a firm deadline.
Well, Tessa, we know, of course, that the European Union was in the middle of negotiating with the United States precisely to avoid this kind of situation. What went wrong?
A lot of analysts here tell us that what went wrong was the divide between the member states. So what we've seen here in recent weeks and months was there was a camp that was pushing for a deal, really any deal, and these were the export-driven countries. So Germany, for example, with its big car industry, or the pharmaceuticals in other countries. So they were saying we need to push for a deal. But France, for example, said, on the other hand, no, we should be more confrontative. Trump doesn't understand anything else, but we have to push him a bit harder. And so what we've seen now is this rift, but really both camps have now been quite surprised by these 30%. What we have to see, though, is that the European Union generally is in quite a complicated situation here, because what we have to understand that this is not only about trade. Ever since Russia invaded Ukraine, a lot of people here in Europe, analysts are saying, well, what happens if Russia decides to come into Europe as well? And if that should happen, a lot of analysts are questioning whether Europe would be ready to defend itself. And so a lot of people here are saying we need the US to defend ourselves. We need the nuclear deterrence. So ultimately, can we provoke Trump on trade if we need him on defense? An interesting question, and we will see what happens on Monday when EU trade ministers meet here.
That was Tessa Walther reporting from Brussels, as well as Jens Korte, who joined us from New York. Many thanks indeed to you both.